This video is about 2-2, rounding whole numbers and decimals. You should be familiar with how to round numbers already. This rhyme is one that's going to help us remember how we round numbers. So when you are rounding, for example, if I had the number 12,064, and it says round to the hundredth spot, or the place of the underlined digit, which is the hundredth place value spot. We would use our rhyme to help us. It says find your number, so here's the hundred spot. Look right next door. 4 or less, just ignore. 5 or more, add 1 more. Since this number next door, 6, is 5 or more, we go up to the next 100. So this becomes, the 0 becomes a 1. And when you have whole numbers, you fill in the rest of the place value spots with zeros. Basically, 12,064 is in between 12,000 and 12,100 when we're rounding to the nearest 100. Here would be 12,064. But since it's a little more than halfway, we round up. Let's try another one. Let's look at rounding with a decimal number. If I had the number 5.023 and I was asked to round to the hundredths place, let's look at our rhyme. Find your number, so here's the hundredths place. Look right next door. 4 or less, just ignore. 5 or more, add 1 more. So my 2 falls under the 4 or less, just ignore. So that means that my 2 is going to stay the same. And with decimals, we don't need to add a 0 at the end here. We just drop everything after the number that we're looking at. So, what's the difference between rounding with a whole number and rounding with decimals? One thing that's different is what you do after the number that you're rounding to. So let's look at two examples, one a whole number and one a decimal. If I wanted to round 34,739 to the nearest thousands, let's follow our rhyme. Find your number, here's the thousands spot. Look next door. 4 or less, just ignore. 5 or more, add 1 more. Since we have a 7 there, that falls under the category of 5 or more, so we need to add 1 more. So since that 7 tells us to add 1 more, I add my 1 more to the thousands place, because that's the place value spot that we are rounding to and that we're looking at. So that 4 becomes a 5. And after that, I can't just leave it at 35 because it needs to be 35,000. So I fill in the rest of the place value spots with zeros, the hundreds, tens, and 1 spot. I remember this because in the word whole, like whole numbers, there's an O or a 0. So when you have whole numbers after the rounding digit, everything else becomes a 0. Now let's look at an example of a decimal number. Let's say we had 84 and 732 thousandths, and it wanted me to round to the tenths place. So let's follow our rhyme. Find your number. Here's the tenths place. Look next door. 4 or less, just ignore. 5 or more, add 1 more. Since to the right, next door, we have a 3, which is 4 or less, we're just going to ignore. We're going to leave our 7 the same, so we'll have 84.7. Now with decimals, you don't need to add zeros at the end, so we can just leave it there. For decimals, think about it, decimals starts with a D, D for drop. With decimals, when you're rounding, after the rounding digit, you drop everything else, whether you go up or down. Use what we talked about in the last slides, and I want you to try and round this number on your own. 748,397, and you are rounding to the thousandths. Here's the thousandths, so you're rounding this to the nearest thousandths. Good luck!